It seemed like there was more and more arguments, and everything she did, I feel like, he thought was wrong. And even as she said in the body cam, he didn't even support her with her blog, which that's not what a fiance or boyfriend does.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at 3 obvious clues we all missed in the interview with Rose Davis, Gabby's best friend. On September 17th, Gabby's friend Rose Davis gave an on-camera interview to the Daily Mail, and that was the clip I played to you at the beginning of this episode. What stood out during that interview by one of the few people who knew Brian and Gabby as a couple, including the dark side of that relationship, was Davis's description of Brian as a controlling and manipulative figure. And these words are actually brought up in an article based on the Daily Mail article by the New York Post. Quote, Rose Davis, 21, of Sarasota, described Laundrie as a controlling and manipulative boyfriend. We got a sample of both the control and manipulation on camera during the Moab incident. But there were 3 things in Davis's statement that were easy to miss while we were focused on the controlling Brian and the manipulative Brian. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I'm going to talk to you guys about the live stream. It'll be at 2, perhaps even closer to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. And I'll be telling you more about that at the end of this episode. But let's start off with these 3 clues. And the first one is of the paranoid Brian. I don't think this has been discussed enough in terms of all of this, in terms of the story of Gabby and Brian's relationship. I feel like the New York Post review of the Daily Mail interview with Rose Davis nicely highlighted the pertinent points. Davis mentioned Brian having, quote, episodes, but more specifically having jealousy issues and hearing voices and being unable to sleep. The exact quote reads from Rose Davis, quote, he's got these jealousy issues and he struggles from what Gabby called these episodes where he would hear things and hear voices and wouldn't sleep, end quote. Those are Rose Davis's words to the Daily Mail. I think many of us misread these to be almost in isolation. In other words, that Brian had various symptoms at various times, and during these episodes he might have at various times felt jealous, heard voices, or not been able to sleep. I think we need to see further into the fabric and draw inferences. For example, what if during an episode all 3 were happening at the same time, meaning when he couldn't sleep, he actually heard voices and became crazed with jealousy. Think of all 3 sort of working together and almost building on one another, almost standing on one another's shoulders. Imagine the jealousy you feel when you can't sleep. Imagine the voices you hear when you're feeling jealous. Imagine not being able to sleep because you're hearing voices and because this feeling of jealousy is welling up inside of you. Now, you can imagine if these episodes occurred more and more often, and Rose Davis does mention their relationship becoming increasingly problematic.
Within the first year, I want to say at least 7 to 10 times. It was a jealousy issue, and it caused a huge argument between them, and she came over and cried and just talked to me about what happened and told me all that she was comfortable telling me. I believe that their relationship, as they kept going on, was getting a little, problematic. Just seemed like there was more and more arguments.
And that audio clip is courtesy of the Daily Mail. I'll put a link to that in the description. And so what you can get through that is Rose Davis mentioning their relationship becoming increasingly problematic with more and more arguments. But what do you think was causing this uptick in jealousy? After all, prior to the summer epic, Rose herself was sort of a problem in Brian's eyes, and Brian worried that Gabby might meet other people, might make friends or meet other guys when he wasn't there. And in a way, Rose could facilitate this. Rose might, I'm not sure if Rose was single herself, but two girls going out, the chances are that they would meet other people. And Brian wasn't very comfortable with that. But what could have caused those same feelings, and let's be straight, paranoid feelings, when Gabby was right beside him? So why would Brian have a reason to feel jealous or paranoid when Gabby was right with him in the van? Now, I think the one obvious answer is social media. The summer epic necessitated a heck of a lot of social media, far more than they actually produced. And I think one reason their output was lower than it should have been, was because Brian was trying to control it, was controlling Gabby to protect their relationship. It was his way of protecting their relationship. At the same time, this low output was a source of stress for Gabby, because that was the point of the summer epic. That was how they meant to make a living. Brian only seemed to want their relationship to work, whereas Gabby wanted their work to work. And as time went on, these differing priorities caused more stress, more arguments, more anxiety, and more paranoia for both of them, but especially Brian. And that brings us to the second insight here, the second clue. Brian was specifically paranoid that Gabby was going to leave him. And that may seem obvious here, but what I'm not sure is obvious is the reason that Brian was so paranoid. How is it actually playing out? What is really driving this? So think about, even before the summer epic, Brian was constantly worried Gabby was going to leave him. And we know this because that is what Rose Davis said, that Brian was constantly worried that Gabby was going to leave him, not just infrequently, right? It's easy to underestimate the portent of Davis's words when she said, quote, he was always worried Gabby was going to leave him, end quote. In other words, it was constant. Now, I want to link this sentiment to what happened at the Spread Creek camp. Imagine if you are always worried someone is going to leave you. At some point, you're going to have made something up in your mind, and the other person is going to have to defend themselves. And what if there's this perception that you've caught someone out, even when maybe you haven't, or maybe you have? But this means that there would be constant surveillance. So in this scenario of being constantly worried that someone's going to leave you, there's going to be constant surveillance, constant paranoia, and frequent arguments. Someone who's being unfairly scrutinized, unfairly accused, is also going to kick back and say, you know, it's based on nothing. I don't have anyone else in mind. Stop sort of pushing me. Stop suspecting me. Stop worrying, kind of thing. You know, just be happy and enjoy what we're doing together. And I think as things changed, and the summer epic and the social media that went with it, I think there were significant changes, right? In terms of that surveillance, in terms of that paranoia and arguing. I think the surveillance, paranoia, and arguing also changed as the social media changed, in frequency and in intensity. Brian was also quite right to be concerned about their relationship, because Gabby had told her mother that they'd called it off. That's actually in the article. It's unclear whether Brian told his parents the same thing. You can imagine in a scenario where you're engaged and you think you're getting married, and the one person actually tells her parents, well, we've called off the marriage. The other person may feel, no, we haven't. It's still on. It's still happening. How insecure you're going to feel under those circumstances. Another point to reiterate is that the original plan was for Rose Davis to join Gabby and Brian for a portion of the summer epic in Yellowstone. Did you know that? This was put into motion in early August, this plan that Gabby's friend would join them, that would effectively be a trio in Yellowstone. This was put into motion in early August, just a week or two prior to the Moab incident. And one wonders whether the Moab incident, some of the arguments that took place there were based on the idea of Rose joining them later that same month. And so obviously it was coming to a head when the couple arrived in Wyoming in late August. And one wonders, had Gabby said, we're not going to invite Rose, or was it just unfinished business? It was something that hadn't been fully, there wasn't closure to the idea. Think about it, Gabby was actually murdered 2 days before Rose Davis's 21st birthday on the 27th. Perhaps Brian was afraid that if Rose met up with Gabby, she'd replace him. Perhaps he knew Gabby would tell Rose the truth, that they were arguing more than ever, that the police were actually involved in one incident, that Brian was actually hitting her, injuring her even, and that she was crying a lot. And given the fact that Gabby had previously left Brian when he was having his episodes, think about this, in the past, when there was no summer epic, Gabby would leave Brian when he was having an episode, and she'd seek comfort, safety, and sanctuary with Rose. This happened not just once, but in Rose's words, 7 to 10 times in a year. And Brian may well have feared that this was on the cards again, but this would be totally different. If Rose joined Gabby, then Brian would kind of be sent home during what is supposed to be kind of like their honeymoon, kind of like an unofficial marriage journey, right? And I'll get to some more information about that in a moment. Brian may have feared that he would be replaced almost kind of permanently in a significant way by Rose. It had happened in the past, so couldn't this happen again? And after this, would there be any coming back for him? You know, it's one thing for Gabby to go to Rose when she was at home, but to have an adventure with her together, they might really enjoy it. Gabby might be really happy and might really enjoy it without Brian there, without Brian being a downer, without Brian controlling everything. So if Brian was very insecure about his looks and his social power and his social media power versus Gabby's, and I think he had reason to be, then he would have wanted to maintain control over Gabby, and that meant locking Rose out of the equation. It's likely this was a huge bone of contention, which is why Gabby never contacted Rose subsequently in August. That's according to Rose, according to what I understand, and not after the Moab incident, and not while she was alone in a hotel in Salt Lake City for almost a week. You kind of get the feeling that Gabby was very wary of Brian and what Brian had told her that he wanted her to do and not to do. So what happened on August 27th that changed things? Possibly during the Mary Piglet's lunch or sometime after, with just 2 days to go before Rose's birthday. And I think it was her 21st birthday, and those birthdays, the 21st is a milestone in a young person's life. It's quite a big day. Gabby may have broached the subject again. Bear in mind, Gabby herself had just turned 21, not that long ago. So she knew what a big deal it was. And so Gabby may have broached the subject. Bear in mind, Rose had actually taken off work. She'd actually arranged leave from work. So it was going to be awkward to not only for Gabby, it's going to be awkward for Gabby not only to leave her friend in the lurch, but leave her in the lurch on her birthday, and on such a special birthday as well. From Brian's perspective, Rose was a huge threat to their relationship. If Gabby had very few friends because of Brian, Rose nevertheless represented twice as many friends as Brian had, if you count Gabby as his friend. But essentially that's 2 against 1, and an immature Brian, an insecure Brian, and an inadequate Brian may have feared losing complete control over Gabby in a scenario where disapproving Rose arrived on the scene and advised her bestie accordingly. And as I say, part of that intervention may have been Gabby and Rose choosing to exclude Brian from the remainder of the summer epic. It's also possible Brian's trip back to Florida was a sort of test run, not in actuality, not like Brian saying, hey, this is a test run, or Gabby saying, let's make this a test run, but after the fact, that is what it felt like, or that is what it effectively was, or what it would be like for Gabby not to be with Brian for an extended period, and vice versa. And perhaps Gabby felt she actually enjoyed Brian not being around that much, and perhaps Brian felt the opposite. I also wonder who paid for what when Gabby stayed in the hotel and Brian flew back to Florida and then back to Salt Lake City. And that brings us to the third and final point. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. I will deal with this in more detail in the live this evening. This evening my time, this afternoon your time. The final point I want to address is one of the least covered, as far as I'm aware, by others analyzing the case. In fact, when I Google Brian Laundrie hearing voices, my own live video from September 30th comes up as the second hit, I guess, on Google, the second impression, I guess. It's really an important subject that hasn't gotten a lot of traction for some reason. I also lost track of the significance of the hearing voices part until something strange happened to me. I actually received a message from a friend of mine about a relative who was hearing voices. I'm not going to go into any more detail here. I will be talking about that aspect during the live. But it is a very important aspect that I think provides almost the missing link to this case. And so the final point I really want to make is the date that Brian asked Gabby to marry him. As far as I know, it was July 2nd, 2020. Have a look at that from this Instagram post where Gabby says, "Here's a picture from our first date because I have so much love for you. Brian asked me to marry him and I said yes." And I think that this post is the day that Brian asked Gabby to marry him. July 2nd, 2020, as I say, is the date Gabby posted this, but it's also the same day that they left for the summer epic, exactly the same day that they departed on their summer epic a year later. For Brian, symbolically, I think the summer epic was a sort of honeymoon. It was like they were actually married. The carefully curated social media posts start on July 5th, 3 days later, presenting the trip as an idyllic journey shared by a happy couple, except it wasn't. I think Brian could keep up the pretense that everything was going okay, that everything was normal in his heart and in his mind, even as the relationship deteriorated. And I think he could keep up the pretense of what was going on as long as certain posts were put on social media and as long as he had control of Gabby. But Rose's imminent entry on the scene threatened to spoil the fairy tale. What do you guys think? So I'm not going to take it further than that. I've just heard from one of my mods that she's only going to be available closer to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I think I'm going to start the live at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.